My name is Evadne Whitlock, though most people in Charleston just call me Ava. I am 72 years old, a retired professor of literature who still corrects grammar in the newspaper margins with a red pen. I like order, civility, and the quiet rhythm of my house on Rutledge Avenue, a house built of brick and patience, where I have lived for nearly 50 years. That quiet was broken at 5 o'clock this evening. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table while I was rinsing teacups, and the message lit up the screen with the kind of casual cruelty only family can deliver. Borrowing your old, worthless necklace for the party. Hope you don't mind. H. The initials belong to Helena, my daughter, my only child. I read the words twice the way I once asked students to read a poem before deciding what it meant. Worthless, she wrote. Borrowing, she claimed. My hand tightened around the porcelain cup until I thought it might crack. That necklace was not worthless. It was inventory item number 512 in the catalog my late husband Mark and I had built with care, every piece authenticated, insured, and appraised. A necklace of rose-tinted diamonds arranged in a delicate French setting from 1920, valued at $5 million. To Helena, it was just another trinket from her aging mother's drawer. I could have stormed across town to the Plaza Hotel and pulled it from her throat myself. But after 72 years, I've learned that fury burns fast and leaves only ashes. Strategy, on the other hand, keeps its shape. So I typed back with deliberate steadiness, "Have fun, dear." Then I set down the phone, dried my hands, and reached for the leather-bound ledger Mark had left behind. I turned to page 137, ran my finger over the line that read, Item 5 to 12. Pink diamond necklace, French origin, 1920. $5,000 $. I closed the book, picked up the phone again, and dialed the only man who knew every secret entry. Miles Carter, our lawyer and Mark's oldest friend. "Miles," I said when he answered, my voice calmer than my pulse. "We need to activate the protocol. Helena just stole inventory item 512. There was a pause. Then the scrape of his chair, as if he'd stood up. "Eva, are you certain I have the message right here?" She called it worthless. "She has no idea what she's done." His tone shifted into the clipped certainty I remembered from Mark's estate meetings. "All right. I'll notify the insurer and the police unit. We'll treat this as grand theft. Sit tight. I'll call you once the paperwork is filed." When I ended the call, the house was very still. The scent of jasmine drifted through the open window, mingling with the salt air from the harbor. My hands no longer shook. Instead, I felt a strange relief, as if 10 years of being diminished and dismissed had funneled into this single moment of clarity. The necklace was no longer the point. The point was that Helena believed she could take anything of mine without consequence. I placed the ledger back behind the portrait of Mark in the study and poured myself another cup of tea. Outside, the shadows of the oaks lengthened across the street. Inside, I knew the real reckoning had only just begun. After I hung up with Miles, I walked into the front parlor and drew back the curtains. The evening light spilled across the old oak floors, turning the wood golden, the way it does only in Charleston. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the occasional clip of a carriage horse and the murmur of tourists tracing the cobblestones with their cameras. This city has a way of holding its history close, as if every brick and iron gate carries its own whispered story. Mine, too, is etched into these walls. Mark and I bought this house on Rutledge Avenue 46 years ago. We raised our son Daniel here. Later, Helena returned as a grown woman with her quick words and sharper edges. For the past decade, though, it hasn't felt like my home. It's felt like a stage where I was cast in the role of furniture present but overlooked. Helena has a talent for diminishing people without raising her voice. She would breeze through the doorway in her tailored dresses, leaving the scent of expensive perfume hanging in the air, and toss her handbag on the antique mahogany table, as if it were nothing more than plywood. "Mother, you should consider moving into one of those lovely communities on James Island," she once said, pouring herself a glass of wine without offering me any. "It would be easier for everyone." Easier meaning easier for her. Daniel would sit at the table, eyes lowered, fiddling with his wedding ring. He would mutter, "Mom is fine here, Helena," but there was no conviction in it. "My son has his father's quiet temperament, but not his strength to stand against a storm." Each time Helena pushed, Daniel's silence grew heavier, as if he believed ignoring the insult might somehow erase it. There were small humiliations, each one stacking on the next, until I felt buried under them. At Christmas, when relatives gathered, Helena presented me with a box wrapped in shiny paper. Inside was a scarf so thin I could see straight through it, the kind of thing picked from a clearance rack. She laughed when I unfolded it, saying, "We didn't want to waste money on something extravagant. At your age, you don't need much." Everyone chuckled, and I smiled tightly, swallowing the sting. Another time, she invited her circle of acquaintances for a book club meeting in my own living room. I had been reading quietly in my favorite chair when she leaned down and whispered, "Could you go upstairs? Mother, older folks make people uncomfortable." Her friends glanced at me with pity, as though I were a relic to be moved out of sight. I climbed the staircase slowly that night, each step heavier than the last, carrying the weight of invisibility. Daniel never stopped her. He never said, "This is my mother's house. She has earned her place." Instead, he looked away, pretending he hadn't heard. And I foolishly let the years slip by, telling myself it was better to endure than to fracture what remained of our family. Charleston nights are long when you feel like a stranger in your own home. I used to lie awake listening to the faint hum of the ships moving in the harbor, their horns echoing like reminders that the world outside was still alive, vibrant, unafraid. In here, I felt myself shrinking, an old woman, tiptoeing through rooms she had once ruled with ease. But tonight, with the jasmine drifting through the windows and Miles already moving the wheels of justice, something inside me shifted. Perhaps it was the way Helena's text dripped with entitlement. Perhaps it was 10 years' worth of small cuts finally bleeding together. Whatever it was, I no longer felt like vanishing into shadows. I touched the cool glass of the window pane, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. Charleston holds its ghosts proudly. They are part of the city's marrow. For too long, I've let Helena make me into one of them, unseen, unheard, hovering in corners. Not anymore. Tomorrow would bring whispers and consequences, but tonight, for the first time in years, I felt steady. The walls of this house belonged to me again, and so did the story they carried. When the house grew quiet again, I lit a single lamp in the study. Its amber glow softened the edges of the shelves Mark had built with his own hands. This room had always been his sanctuary, a place for maps books and the meticulous order he loved. I stood before the portrait that hangs above the mantel, the one of him taken when we celebrated our 30th anniversary. His eyes in the painting, steady and amused, seemed to follow me as if he were still guarding the secrets behind it. I reached up, lifted the frame from its hook, and set it aside. Behind it lay the steel face of the safe. The numbers of the combination were etched in my memory as clearly as my own birth date, 4/2/19, the day Mark proposed to me under the live oaks in White Point Garden. My fingers moved without hesitation, and with a soft click, the heavy door opened. Inside rested the legacy Mark had built quietly in the last decade of his life. Jewelry, rare books, antique coins, documents in neat envelopes, everything arranged with a precision that had once irritated me and now comforted me. It wasn't the wealth itself that mattered, but the proof of his trust. He had believed I could safeguard this inheritance when the time came that I would know when to remain silent and when to act. I pulled out the ledger, its leather cover worn smooth from years of careful handling. Turning through the pages was like listening to Mark's voice reciting facts in his calm professorial tone. Each entry listed with inventory number, provenance, appraisal, value, insurance policy, and photograph. He had thought of everything, anticipating not just my stewardship, but also the skepticism of anyone who might doubt me. I stopped at page 137. The handwriting, his tidy, deliberate script, named it clearly, item 5 to 12, pink diamond necklace, French origin, circa 1920, appraised value $5,000 US, insured to full amount. Beside the entry, a photograph was affixed with meticulous care. I lifted the photo closer to the lamplight. The necklace was as familiar to me as my own wedding ring. Delicate platinum links curved into a setting that framed a 5-carat pink diamond at its center, surrounded by smaller stones that caught light like scattered drops of wine. It had been crafted by a Parisian jeweler who had worked for the Grande Maison of the early 20th century. Even to untrained eyes, it gleamed with an elegance that time had not dulled. Mark had shown it to me only once a few months before he died. We sat together in this very study, his voice weakened, but still certain. "Ava," he said, lifting the necklace from its velvet box, "never underestimate the power of what looks ordinary. People see what they expect. If you let them believe this is worthless, it will stay safe. But you must always remember what it truly is." At the time, I thought it excessive, his habit of cataloging and insuring each item of photographing and locking away what we never wore. But tonight, as I read his notes, I felt a surge of gratitude. He had not only left me treasure, he had left me armor. I replaced the photograph carefully, my hands steady. Helena's text replayed in my mind, worthless necklace. How blind she was to think so little of me, to believe anything I possessed could be dismissed with a word. She had no idea she'd wrapped her fingers around the most valuable piece of her father's secret collection. I returned the ledger to its shelf inside the safe, closed the heavy door, and slid the portrait back into place. Mark's painted eyes seemed to hold a spark of approval, as though he knew I had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about sentiment or survival. I was not simply an old woman defending a trinket. I was the keeper of a fortune, and at last I was prepared to act as such. The phone rang just as I finished sliding the portrait back into place. Miles's voice carried its usual steadiness, though I caught an edge of urgency beneath it. "Ava, I've spoken with the insurer. They're alerting the specialized recovery unit now. I'll be filing the theft report within the next 15 minutes. His words reassured me more than I expected. For years, I had doubted whether Mark's obsessive cataloging would ever matter. Tonight, it mattered more than anything. "What happens next?" I asked, pressing the phone to my ear with both hands. "The insurer submits the theft report to the Charleston Police Department. Because the necklace is registered and insured at that valuation, the police treat it as a major property crime. They'll request an immediate warrant to seize the item wherever it is found. Likely within the hour." The hour. I pictured Helena at the Plaza Hotel, her hair arranged in that sculpted way she loved, gold dress, catching the light, the necklace lying against her throat. She must have been preening already, basking in the admiration of other guests. The thought made my stomach tighten. "And Helena?" I asked quietly. "That depends," Miles said. "Technically, she has committed grand larceny. But you'll be asked whether you wish to press full criminal charges. For now, the focus is on recovering the necklace intact." His tone softened, almost paternal. "Sit down, Ava. Make yourself some tea. I'll call when the warrant is confirmed." When the call ended, the house seemed impossibly large. I moved into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. The hiss of the gas flame was grounding ordinary. a reminder that life could still be reduced to small rituals even as larger storms gathered outside. I chose the blue porcelain cup Mark had given me on our 25th anniversary, its glaze patterned like ocean waves. I measured the tea leaves carefully, waiting for the water to boil. And when it did, I poured slowly, watching the steam curl upward in delicate threads. My hands trembled as I lifted the cup, but once the rim touched my lips, the motion steadied me. The clock above the pantry door ticked louder than usual, each second stretching long. Somewhere downtown, Helena was laughing in a ballroom, utterly unaware that a legal tide was rising against her. I carried the tea into the parlor and sat near the window. Outside, the gas lamps along Rutledge Avenue flickered on, casting amber halos against the growing dusk. A couple strolled past, their hands-linked, voices low and warm. I thought of Mark again, how he had trusted me with all of this. Tonight, his trust became my spine. Half an hour later, the phone buzzed again. I set down the cup and answered. Ava Miles said the warrant is approved. The recovery unit is en route to the Plaza Hotel. They'll enter quietly, no scene unless necessary. I've also notified the hotel's security chief to expect them. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice steady. How long? 45 minutes, perhaps less. Stay by your phone. I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment, I closed my eyes and simply breathed, letting the quiet fill me. Fear still pressed at the edges of my chest, but beneath it was a calm determination. The machinery was in motion. The necklace was not lost, it was on its way back. I lifted my cup again, finishing the last swallow of tea gone lukewarm. The taste was faint, but grounding. I set the cup aside and smoothed my hands over my lap, as if straightening invisible wrinkles. Helena thought she had taken something worthless. In truth, she had triggered a chain of events neither she nor Daniel could possibly control. The ledger was no longer just a record. It was a weapon, and tonight, for the first time in years, I felt prepared to wield it. The clock chimed 7. Soon the doors of that grand hotel would open, not for applause, but for reckoning. The minutes after Miles's second call stretched like taut wire. I tried to busy myself with simple things, folding dish towels, straightening the books on the coffee table, but my mind refused distraction. I kept seeing Helena's fingers brushing the clasp of the necklace, her casual smirk, as she tapped out that message. When the doorbell rang at 7:30, I startled. Through the glass, I recognized Miles's tall frame, his silver hair neat as ever, and beside him, a man I didn't know. I opened the door quickly, the cool night air carrying in the scent of the sea. Eva Miles said softly, "This is James Parker. He's worked with me for years on matters of asset protection." James extended his hand. He was in his early 50s with the weathered calm of someone who'd spent a lifetime observing more than he spoke. His handshake was firm, but not showy. "I wanted you to meet him tonight," Miles continued, "because there are details you deserve to know before the police return your property." We moved into the parlor. I set out cups and poured fresh tea, my old habits insisting on civility, even when my insides churned. James laid a slim leather folder on the table and looked at me with careful respect. "Mrs. Whitlock," he began, "I've been conducting discreet inquiries since December, after Miles mentioned your concerns about misplaced items. You thought it might be forgetfulness, perhaps age. I'm afraid it wasn't." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, grainy stills from security cameras, receipts from pawn shops, copies of sales slips. Each bore dates and signatures. The first image showed Helena in a tailored coat standing at the counter of a small jewelry shop on Meeting Street. In her hand, a silver brooch with marcasite stones. I hadn't worn in years. The next slip listed a pair of pearl earrings my mother's passed down through generations, sold for a fraction of their worth. My breath caught. No, I whispered. I've confirmed at least 12 separate transactions, James said gently. Antique brooches, pearl studs, a Victorian locket, even a silver chain. The amounts are modest compared to tonight's necklace, $45,000 in total, but the pattern is clear. She chose pieces that could vanish without raising alarm items buried at the back of drawers. She was clever enough to pick what you didn't use often. I pressed my palm to my forehead, trying to steady the dizziness that rose. For months, I had scolded myself when things went missing. I had told Daniel, even Helena, that I couldn't remember where I'd placed them. Helena had smiled with that thin patience, murmuring, "Don't worry, Mother. It's normal to misplace things at your age." The room swayed around me. It hadn't been age. It had been theft carried out under my own roof by the daughter I once sang to sleep. Miles leaned forward. "Eva, I know this is painful, but you need the truth before decisions are made in the next few hours. The necklace isn't an isolated incident. It's the culmination." I traced a finger across one of the receipts. The ink was smeared, but her signature was clear. Helena Whitlock. A name she had carried from me, now written over my losses. Betrayal doesn't arrive all at once. It drips in slowly until one day you find yourself drenched. Tonight, I felt the water closing over my head. James closed the folder respectfully, as though shielding me from further blows. "She's been documenting your belongings as well, taking photographs likely to appraise what else might be worth selling. We found evidence on her phone, discrete snapshots of your cabinets and drawers." I looked at the lamplight catching the edges of Mark's portrait. My husband had trusted me to guard what he left behind. For months, while I blamed myself for failing memory, Helena had been stripping pieces of that legacy away. The tea in my cup had gone cold. I lifted it anyway, just to feel something steady in my hand. My throat ached, but my voice, when it came, was clear. "Then tonight," I said, "is not just about a necklace. It's about every lie she let me swallow while she emptied this house." Neither Miles nor James replied. They didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. The Plaza Hotel stood glowing against the Charleston night, its marble steps lit by chandeliers that spilled their brilliance out onto Meeting Street. Horse-drawn carriages paused at the curb, unloading men in dark suits and women in gowns whose colors shimmered like jewels under the gas lamps. This was Helena's world, the polished surface of wealth she always craved. Inside the grand ballroom, every detail gleamed. Crystal candelabras glowed against mirrored walls, and waiters wove among the guests, carrying trays of champagne. Helena thrived in such rooms, her voice pitched just high enough to be overheard, her laughter echoing like a bell meant to draw attention. Tonight, she had her bait. Around her neck hung the necklace, my necklace. The pink diamond lay perfectly against the hollow of her throat, each smaller stone catching the light in a halo of fire. She had paired it with a gold gown, its cut daring but precise, as though she had rehearsed for weeks to display herself in just this way. Guests circled her as moths to a flame. I could imagine them marveling at her find, asking where such a treasure had come from. Helena, with her usual confidence, tilted her chin and smiled. "An old piece from my mother," she must have said, dismissing it with a wave of her hand. Practically worthless, but I thought it had character. The lie tasted sweet to her. She relished the way heads nodded, the way admiration deepened. The necklace made her radiant, and she believed the light belonged to her. In the corner of the room, unnoticed at first, two plainclothes officers stepped inside. They did not move hurriedly. Instead, they blended among the guests, pausing to admire the decor, to accept a glass of champagne they did not drink. The hotel's security chief accompanied them, whispering updates through a discreet earpiece. From the balcony above, a quartet struck the first notes of a waltz, and couples drifted onto the floor. Helena remained at the center, refusing to dance, preferring to bask in the glow of eyes trained on her. Her hand lifted to touch the diamond, her smile poised every inch the woman she longed to be. Then the officers advanced. One approached Helena directly, leaning close enough that only those nearest could hear. The other gestured quietly to the security chief, who nodded and signaled for the music to soften. Conversation faltered, and the air shifted with the tension of curiosity. Helena's face stiffened. Her smile, fixed in place, trembled at the edges as the officer spoke. She laughed too loudly, as though brushing off some absurd mistake, but her hand dropped from the necklace, clutching her glass instead. The officer extended a gloved hand. His words carried just enough for nearby guests to catch Mrs. Whitlock. "We need to recover this property. It has been reported stolen." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Helena's color drained as if someone had snuffed a candle. She clutched the necklace with both hands, protesting in a voice that carried farther than she intended. "This is mine. My mother gave it to me." There's been some misunderstanding, but the words sounded thin against the silence that followed. The officer held up a document, the official warrant stamped and signed. Hotel security stood firm at his side. With no choice left, Helena's fingers unhooked the clasp. The diamond gleamed one last time at her throat before it was lifted away, placed carefully into a velvet-lined case. Whispers surged through the crowd, admiration twisted swiftly into suspicion. People drew back, not wanting to be too near. Phones appeared, screens lighting as guests began to capture the spectacle. Helena's elegance cracked in that moment, shattered like porcelain dropped onto marble. She stood rigid, her gown wrinkling at the waist, her lips parted but voiceless. The diamond no longer crowned her. It condemned her, and in Charleston's most glittering room beneath chandeliers, meant to dazzle, humiliation fell harder than any blow. The grand ballroom had erupted in whispers, but it was in the marble lobby where the storm truly broke. I arrived with Miles at my side, the weight of the leather briefcase in his hand, carrying more force than a gavel. The revolving doors turned, releasing us into a corridor of gilt mirrors and hushed astonishment. Guests lingered near the walls, their curiosity outpacing their sense of decorum. Helena sat on a velvet settee, her gown creased her hair, falling loose at the temples. Beside her stood Daniel, his face drawn, his posture taut as a violin string pulled too far. He looked at me the way a boy looks at an approaching teacher, torn between shame and the desperate hope of reprieve. "Mom," he said, stepping forward, his voice low but urgent. "You have to tell them this is all a mistake. The necklace, it wasn't stolen. Helena just borrowed it. You didn't tell us it was worth anything." I stopped in the center of the lobby, letting the weight of silence fill the space. Miles opened the briefcase and drew out the thick folder of documents, appraisals, certificates of authenticity, insurance papers, every page bearing Mark's careful foresight. He handed them to the detective who had just approached us, a broad-shouldered man with a badge clipped to his belt. "Detective, here is the complete record," Miles said. "Inventory item, 512, appraised value, $5 million. Mrs. Whitlock is the sole legal owner." The officer thumbed through the pages with efficient precision, his nod curt. He turned to Helena. "Ma'am, the evidence is clear. The property was taken without authorization. You'll need to cooperate fully." Helena surged to her feet, her voice slicing through the murmur of onlookers. "This is ridiculous. She told me I could wear anything I liked. She's just changing her mind now to embarrass me. I'm her daughter. Do you think she'd really call the police on me?" Her words rang false, even to her own ears. She looked around the lobby, searching for allies among the strangers who would not meet her gaze. Daniel reached for my hand, his grip trembling. "Mom, please. This will ruin her." You can't let it go this far. I studied him. My son, the child I had carried, the man I had watched, grow into someone both kind and cowardly. His eyes pleaded, but they also revealed the truth. He wanted me to absorb the cost, as I always had, to make the ugliness vanish so he could return to his quiet corner of avoidance. I withdrew my hand slowly. Daniel, your wife didn't just borrow, she stole. And she did it because she believed I was invisible, that nothing of mine mattered. Helena's composure fractured. You're lying, she hissed, her voice jagged. You've been slipping, forgetting things. You probably misplaced half of what's in that safe. This is your way of covering your mistakes. Miles spoke before I could. Mrs. Whitlock's memory is intact. What isn't intact is your story. We have pawn receipts, surveillance footage, and testimony tying you to other pieces from this household. The detective nodded, signaling to his colleague, who stepped closer. Helena's bravado faltered. She clutched Daniel's sleeve, eyes wide now, panic blooming in her voice. Danny, do something. Tell them she's old, she doesn't understand. You can't let them take me like this. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at me again, and for the first time in years I saw him without Helena's shadow cast across his face. He looked small, diminished, ashamed. I drew myself taller. Spine straight as the oaks that lined the battery. Detective, I said clearly, I am pressing charges. The words settled into the lobby like the final toll of a bell. Helena sagged back against the settee, her face crumpling, her denial finally colliding with consequence. Daniel lowered his head, the silence between us sharper than any blade. For the first time in a decade, I was not invisible. I was undeniable. The lobby emptied slowly after the officers escorted Helena away, their voices firm, her protests trailing like a frayed ribbon. The guests who lingered offered nervous glances but no words. I stood in the stillness, my pulse steady, for the first time in years. Miles murmured that he would follow the detectives to the station and left me near the tall windows where the night pressed against the glass like a witness. Daniel remained rooted to the spot. His shoulders slumped, his hands limp at his sides. For a long moment, he didn't speak, only stared at the floor as if the marble tiles might offer him absolution. I waited, giving him space to find words that should have been spoken years ago. Finally, he whispered, "Mom, how could you? She's my wife." I turned to him, my voice measured. "And I am your mother. For 10 years you let her cut me down in my own home, and not once did you defend me. Tonight was not a betrayal. It was the inevitable result of your silence." His head snapped up, eyes filled with something between shame and defiance. "You don't understand. If I pushed back, she'd explode. I thought. If I kept the peace, things would calm down eventually." I stepped closer, the hem of my coat brushing the marble. "Peace at my expense, Daniel. Do you hear yourself? Every insult she hurled, every time she made me disappear into my room while she entertained in my parlor, you swallowed it. Not because you believed her, but because it was easier than facing her wrath." He flinched, as if my words were physical blows. "I didn't know she was stealing from you. I thought you were misplacing things, forgetting. She told me that's what was happening, and I believed her." The air in my chest tightened, not with anger, but with the ache of recognition. "You believed her because it was simpler than believing me. I told you when I couldn't find my brooch, my pearls. You looked at me with pity as if I were losing my mind. You chose her comfort over my truth." Daniel pressed a hand to his forehead, dragging it down his face. He looked older than his 40 years, lines of exhaustion etched deep. "I was afraid, Mom. Afraid of losing her. Afraid of breaking the marriage. Afraid of being alone." I let his words settle, each one heavy and human, but not excusing. "And so you sacrificed me instead. You let your fear turn me into a shadow in my own house." His eyes filled, though he refused to let the tears fall. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could balance it. Keep her happy. Keep you safe." Safe. My voice sharpened. Safety built on silence is no safety at all. You gave her room to expand, to humiliate, to steal. Tonight was not sudden, Daniel. It was years in the making. Your silence built the stage she performed on. For a moment he broke. His knees bent, and he sat heavily on the velvet settee Helena had abandoned. He covered his face with his hands. "I failed you." I sat beside him, not touching, but near enough that he could feel my presence. "Yes, you did. And I need you to hear that without excuse. I loved your father for his strength and his honesty. I see pieces of him in you, but you've let them rust under the weight of fear. It's time to decide what kind of man you want to be." Daniel lowered his hands. His eyes rimmed red. He nodded once low, as though each movement cost him. The silence between us held more truth than any words he had spoken in a decade. The following morning, Miles arrived at my house with James, the investigator. They carried the same leather briefcase I had seen in the hotel lobby, though now it seemed heavier, as if it contained not only documents, but the weight of 10 years of betrayal. I ushered them into the parlor, the morning light falling through lace curtains onto the rug Mark and I had chosen decades ago. Miles set the case on the coffee table, clicking the clasps open. "Ava," he said, his voice steady, but low, "there are things you need to see. This isn't only about last night." James pulled out a thick file and laid it flat before me. The first page was a pawn shop receipt, a gold brooch sold for $1,200, signed, not with Helena's name, but with an alias that matched her initials. Attached was a blurry photograph from a store camera. Helena leaning across the counter, her smile wide, her hand gesturing to the small piece of my history she had reduced to cash. I turned page after page. A strand of pearls pawned for less than half their worth. A silver hair comb I had worn in my 20s sold for a fraction of its appraisal. Every receipt paired with a still image, every lie recorded in the pawn shop's notes, gift from grandmother estate jewelry, urgent sale, needed for medical bills. Each line burned. I remembered the nights I had searched drawers, convinced I was forgetful. I remembered Daniel's cautious voice telling me it was normal to misplace things as one got older. Helena had crafted that story carefully, and I had nearly believed it. $45,000 in total, James said quietly, spread across nearly 2 years. Small enough amounts to avoid suspicion, but consistent. I traced a finger over the ink, the neat loops of her forged signatures. My body trembled, but not with age, with fury. "There's more," Miles said, sliding a second folder forward. His eyes searched mine. "Ava, this part is harder." Inside lay printouts of emails. Helena's name appeared in the headers sent to a lawyer I had never met. Subject lines read, "Guardianship options, mental competence standards, inheritance challenges." One email froze me cold. "My mother shows signs of memory loss. She forgets items, repeats herself, and seems confused about possessions. I'm concerned she's no longer capable of managing her estate." My breath caught. It was all there, the narrative she had woven, backed by her thefts that made me look careless, by Daniel's silence that let her words gain ground. She had not only stolen my belongings, she had been preparing to steal my mind, one piece of paper at a time. James leaned forward. "She was laying groundwork to have you declared incompetent. Once that happened, she could petition for guardianship and control of the estate. It wasn't just theft. It was strategy." I pressed a hand against my chest, the air sharp in my lungs. To think of my daughter writing those words, setting in motion the erasure of my very self, worse than any missing jewel. For a moment the room swam, the walls too close, the rug beneath me tilting. Then I steadied. My hand flattened against the folder, not to push it away, but to claim it. She underestimated me. I said, my voice clear. She mistook my silence for weakness. She wanted to erase me on paper, but I am still here, and I will not vanish for her convenience. Miles closed the briefcase gently, as if sealing the decision inside. Then we proceed with full charges, he said. I looked toward the window, past the oaks, swaying in the Charleston breeze. My home, my life, my memory, they were mine. And Helena would face every line of evidence she had written against me. The station smelled of paper and stale coffee, the kind of place where time seemed to drag across tiled floors. I sat at a long wooden table, Miles beside me, his briefcase of documents resting within reach like an unspoken shield. Across from us, Detective Alvarez adjusted his glasses, his voice firm but calm. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, we have all the documentation we need to file formal charges. But as the victim, you hold discretion. Do you wish to press them? The words echoed in the quiet room. The decision felt like it hung from the ceiling lights, flickering, demanding. The door opened behind us. Helena entered, escorted by another officer. Her gown had been replaced by a plain gray dress borrowed from Holding. Her wrists were free now, though red marks lingered where the cuffs had pressed. Her eyes darted to mine, sharp and desperate. Mother. She breathed, her voice breaking as she slid into the chair opposite me. Please, you can't do this. It was a mistake. I only wanted to look beautiful, to be admired. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her words, soft and trembling, were the closest thing to humility I had ever heard from her. But even in their softness, I caught the practiced rhythm, the way she leaned forward just enough to evoke pity. I stayed still, my hands folded on the table. A mistake, Helena, is spilling wine on a tablecloth. What you did was theft. And worse, it was deliberate. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached for me, though the table stopped her hand short. I'm your daughter. Your only daughter. How can you call the police on your own blood? Daniel stood against the wall, silent, his arms folded across his chest, as if bracing himself for every word. He hadn't spoken since we arrived, though I felt his gaze pressing against me, begging me to soften. Detective Alvarez tapped his pen once against his notebook. Mrs. Whitlock, I need a clear answer. Do you wish to pursue prosecution? The room hushed again, but inside me, voices clamored. One voice, the mother's voice, whispered of lullabies, scraped knees I had bandaged birthdays with lopsided cakes. The other, firmer voice, the woman I had become, reminded me of the 10 years I had eaten alone in my room, the lies about my mind, the jewels stripped from my drawers, the garden Helena planned to flatten for her entertainment deck. Helena pressed on, her voice tightening. I'll give everything back. Every penny, every piece. I'll go to counseling. She swallowed hard. Just don't let them drag me through court. Please, Mama. The old name landed heavy in the air. Mama. She hadn't called me that in years. For a moment, I nearly flinched. Miles leaned toward me, his whisper steady. Ava, remember, mercy without accountability only teaches her she can do it again. I turned my eyes back to Helena. She looked small now, stripped of her armor of silk and jewels, but her eyes still glittered with calculation beneath the tears. I exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing out of my lungs. Detective, I said clearly, I will press charges. For the necklace, for the thefts, for the lies. I want her held accountable. Helena gasped, a sharp sound, almost a laugh choked with disbelief. You'd destroy your own family for this. No, I answered softly. You destroyed it yourself. I am only refusing to be buried in the rubble. Daniel's eyes closed, his face pale. Helena's tears slid unchecked, now her hands trembling in her lap. Detective Alvarez wrote a final note, then nodded once. Understood, Mrs. Whitlock. We'll proceed. And with that, the line was drawn, not of blood, but of truth. By the next morning, Charleston already knew. The Post and Courier ran the headline above the fold, "Charleston Matriarch Exposes Daughter's $5 million Theft." My name was printed there in bold type, alongside a grainy photograph taken outside the Plaza Hotel. In it, I stood at the marble entrance, with Miles beside me. Helena blurred in the background as officers led her away. The phones began before breakfast. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize, some hanging up when I answered, others spilling into hurried questions. A reporter from Savannah wanted a statement. A woman from Mount Pleasant said she'd always admired my garden and never knew what I'd endured. I declined them all, my voice polite but firm. Still, the ripples spread. By midday, my neighbor Mrs. Carraway knocked at the door with a casserole in her hands. Her eyes were bright with curiosity, poorly disguised as compassion. "Ava dear, I just read." "Well, I can't imagine, but I want you to know you have my support. Everyone in town is talking." I thanked her, accepted the dish, and closed the door gently. Behind the lace curtains, I could see others slowing their walks as they passed, pausing to glance at the shutters as though expecting me to appear framed in the window like a figure in a cautionary tale. By afternoon, the story reached the evening news. A clean-cut anchor delivered it in clipped tones, the footage rolling police cars outside the hotel. Helena's face pale and furious as she ducked behind her hair. Daniel's stiff silence. In a stunning turn, the anchor intoned, "Mrs. Eva Whitlock, 72, provided evidence of long-term thefts by her daughter, totaling millions." I watched from my armchair, the hum of the television filling the parlor that had once been Helena's stage. For years, she had forced me to vanish during parties, to hide in my own bedroom, so her friends wouldn't be uncomfortable. Now it was she who could not escape the glare of public eyes. Later, walking through the market on Broad Street, I felt the whispers trailing me like shadows. Some faces carried pity, others a quiet respect. Vendors I had bought from for decades now greeted me with a new deference, their voices hushed, as if speaking to someone made larger by scandal. A woman I barely knew leaned close near the peach stand. "You were brave," she whispered. Most of us would have stayed silent. Her hand brushed mine, and then she melted back into the crowd. For the first time in years, I was not invisible. And though the attention stung at moments, there was also a strange sweetness in being recognized, not as a frail widow, not as Helena's inconvenient mother, but as myself. Daniel, however, bore the weight differently. That evening, he stood in the kitchen with his hands braced on the counter. His back turned to me. The newspaper lay open beside him. Helena's name splashed across the page. "They're talking about us like we're strangers in a courtroom drama," he said, his voice low. "Neighbors, colleagues, everyone knows." I joined him, resting my hand on the folded edge of the paper. Yes, they know, but for once they know the truth. He closed his eyes, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "I don't know how to live in this city now. Everywhere I go, I'll be the man whose wife stole from his mother. And I said quietly, am the woman who let herself be erased until she couldn't any longer. We don't choose the headlines, Daniel. We choose what we do after they fade." Outside, the bells of St. Michael's tolled their sound, carrying down Meeting Street, rising above the hush of gossip. For years, my life had been shrouded in silence, forced upon me by Helena's disdain. Now Charleston's voices rose loud around me, not all kind, but all-seeing. And perhaps, at last, seeing was enough. The locksmith's van pulled into my driveway just after sunrise. The air smelled faintly of salt drifting in from the harbor, and the oak branches stretched long shadows across the lawn. I stood on the porch, in my robe, coffee in hand, watching as the man unloaded his tools. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet pulse of ownership, not shared, not questioned, but wholly mine. "Every lock, ma'am," he asked, setting down a steel case. "Every lock," I answered. By noon, the house had new keys cool and sharp in my palm. Helena's copies. Daniel's copies, even the ones I had misplaced in old purses, they no longer mattered. The tumblers had turned, and with them, the axis of my home. Inside, I spread out folders across the dining table. Miles had arranged appointments with the bank and the insurance agency. I signed papers until my hand ached. Freezing accounts, securing the collection, in a trust updating passwords, tightening every seam Helena had once pried open. The last document was my will, the one Mark and I had drawn up decades ago when Daniel was still in college and Helena had not yet entered our lives. The ink had yellowed with time. I read the lines slowly, feeling each one falter against the present. I picked up my pen. Helena's name I struck out with a decisive line, my breath steady as the word disappeared beneath the ink. In its place, I left instructions for the foundation Miles had spoken about, funds earmarked for protecting elders against exploitation. My legacy would not vanish into Helena's appetite. That evening, Daniel appeared at the door. He looked thinner, his hair unkempt, his tie loose as though he had been pulling at it all day. In his hand, he held the old brass key, the one that now opened nothing. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I let him in. He stopped at the threshold of the parlor, his eyes landing on the folders still stacked on the table. "You've changed everything." "Yes," I said. "It had to be done." He nodded slowly, then rubbed the back of his neck. "Helena's out on bail. Reporters are calling. I can't stay in that house with her, not now. Not ever again. I don't know where else to go." The words carried more weight than a request. They trembled with a child's need, though he was a grown man standing in my hallway. "Daniel," I said, choosing each word carefully, "this house is safe again, but it will remain safe only if we respect it. That means no keys given out, no doors left unlocked, and no silence when wrong is done." His gaze dropped to the rug. "I know. I failed you." I let her twist me into thinking silence was kindness. I moved closer, not to soften but to steady. "Silence is surrender, Daniel. And I will not surrender my life, my mind, or this home again." He looked up, his eyes red. "Please, Mom. Just for now. Let me stay until I figure things out. I need a place that feels honest." The request stirred both ache and caution. This was the son who had stood mute as Helena mocked me, yet he was also the boy who once ran barefoot through the garden, laughing as Mark hoisted him high. I considered the new locks in my pocket, the crisp papers on the table, the clean lines of ink cutting Helena out of my will. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were survival. "You may stay," I said at last, "but only under my roof, my rules. Respect will be the rent you pay." Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief, his nod slow but genuine. The house felt different already, not only secured by keys and contracts, but by the truth finally spoken aloud. The call came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky hung low and the marsh smelled of brine. I had just finished pruning the camellias when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, marked with the prison's code. For a moment I considered letting it ring out, but my hand reached for the receiver anyway, curiosity and dread tugging equally at me. "Mrs. Whitlock." The voice on the line was clipped official. "You have a call from inmate Helena Whitlock. Do you accept?" My throat tightened. I pressed the button. "Yes." There was a click, a rush of static, and then her voice, thinner, more fragile than I remembered, yet still carrying that edge of command. "Mother." I closed my eyes. It had been weeks since the arraignment, weeks since I had last seen her face pale beneath fluorescent lights. "What do you want, Helena?" "I need you to listen," she said quickly, as if afraid the line might cut. "Not to forgive me, just to hear me." Silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the connection. Finally, she spoke, her words tumbling out in bursts. "I was jealous of you. Always." even before Daddy died. You had this house, this garden, the respect of people in town. You made it look effortless, like you didn't need anyone's approval. And I craved it. Every compliment, every glance at a party, I needed it like air. Her voice faltered. I heard the scrape of something, perhaps a chair in her cell. When I found the brooch in your drawer, I thought it was worthless. I sold it for cash, and nobody noticed. Not you, not Daniel. That's when it started. It wasn't about the money at first. It was the thrill, the power of taking something right under your nose and walking away unseen. I gripped the phone tighter, my jaw stiff. And when I did notice, when I asked about my pearls, my comb, she exhaled a sharp, guilty laugh. I made Daniel believe you were forgetting. I whispered in his ear that it was normal at your age that you were slipping, and he believed me. God, it was so easy. He wanted peace so badly, and I gave him the story he needed. The words stabbed deeper than any theft. She had not only stolen objects, she had stolen my son's trust, warping his view of me. You called me senile, I said flatly. Yes. The word cracked in her throat. I said it because it worked. Because if people thought you were fading, then every missing thing could be blamed on your mind, not me. I told myself it was just strategy, but really it was cruelty. I wanted you smaller, dimmer, so I could shine brighter. Tears pricked my eyes, though they did not fall. And the necklace. She paused, her voice breaking. That was greed, pure and simple. I knew it was valuable the moment I touched it, but I convinced myself you didn't deserve it. That if you weren't showing it off, it might as well belong to me. When the crowd gasped when the cameras flashed, I thought I'd won. And then the police came. And I realized I'd only won shame. The silence on the line grew heavy. I could almost hear her breathing, uneven, brittle. I'm not asking you to change your mind about the charges, she whispered. I know I'll serve time. But I needed you to know it wasn't about hating you. It was about hating myself. The thefts, the lies, they were an addiction. Every time I got away with one, I needed the next. And I dragged Daniel into it with my whispers. I can't undo that. I can only admit it. My chest ached with a strange mixture of rage and sorrow. I wanted to slam the phone down, to scream at her for every lonely dinner, every tear shed in silence. And yet beneath the fury there was a bitter clarity. The truth had a way of cutting clean, leaving wounds that hurt differently, less sharp, more enduring. Helena, I said softly, your confession doesn't heal me. It doesn't excuse you, but it tells me one thing: you always knew exactly what you were doing. And now so does the world. She made a sound, half sob, half sigh, and then the line went dead. I set the receiver back in its cradle, my hand trembling. The house around me was quiet, the camellias still blooming outside the window. For the first time, I understood that confession could be both balm and blade-opening wounds, even as it closed others. 2 weeks after Helena's call, I found myself standing in the oak-paneled meeting room of the Charleston Public Library. The smell of old paper and polished wood carried memories of afternoons I used to spend here with Mark, back when we believed life would stretch endlessly before us. Now, at 72, I was holding a clipboard instead of a book, preparing to speak in front of a dozen faces that mirrored my own years. The idea had begun quietly, an offhand comment from Miles after the arraignment. Ava, you're not the only one, he'd said. Every week I see elders taken advantage of by family, by neighbors, by strangers. You could help them. At first I dismissed it. What wisdom did I have besides scars? But the more I thought, the more I realized scars were lessons written into flesh and memory. The chairs filled slowly, Mrs. Carraway with her pearl earrings, Mr. Jenkins leaning on his cane, a pair of widowed sisters clutching handbags close to their laps. They looked at me with curiosity, but also with the hesitance of people who had learned to keep their troubles hidden. I cleared my throat. Good afternoon. My name is Eva Whitlock, and I suppose you've read enough about me in the paper these last months. What you haven't read is that my story is not unique. Many of us are at risk because we trust too much, because we fear conflict, because we think our belongings are too small to matter. Heads nodded slowly at first, then more firmly. I continued, my voice steadier than I expected. Today we'll talk about practical things. How to catalog your valuables. How to set up safeguards with your bank. How to recognize manipulation, even when it comes from the people closest to you. I opened a folder and pulled out copies of a simple inventory sheet, columns for item descriptions, appraisals, photographs, and insurance details. This form saved me, I explained. It meant that when something went missing, I could prove it existed. I could prove it belonged to me. Mr. Jenkins raised his hand, his knuckles swollen with age. But what if your own children are the ones you suspect? The room hushed. It was the question no one wanted to ask aloud. I met his eyes. Then you must remember, love does not erase the need for boundaries. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. It is survival. And if someone resents you for guarding your own life, the problem lies with them, not with you. A murmur of agreement spread. The widowed sisters exchanged a look heavy with unspoken stories. I passed around small packets, a list of local legal resources, phone numbers for senior advocacy groups, the contact for a locksmith I now trusted. Practical steps, but also symbols that none of us had to remain invisible. As the hour went on, voices grew braver. Mrs. Carraway admitted her grandson had pressured her to sign checks she didn't understand. The sisters confessed their niece had borrowed jewelry that never found its way back. Each confession fell like a pebble in water ripples of recognition spreading through the room. By the time the workshop ended, the silence that had greeted me had transformed into quiet conversation. Neighbors exchanging numbers, promising to check in on one another. The sisters hugged me on their way out, whispering, "You gave us permission to say no." When the last chair was tucked away and the library staff turned off the overhead lights, I lingered by the tall windows. Outside Charleston bustled tourists with cameras, carriages rattling over cobblestones, children chasing pigeons. For years I had walked those same streets feeling like a ghost, unseen, even in my own home. Now I felt rooted. My pain had been pulled into the light, shaped into something useful. Not a spectacle for gossip, but a guide for others. As I gathered the leftover packets, Miles appeared in the doorway. "How did it go?" he asked. I smiled, the kind that carried both exhaustion and pride. Better than I thought. They listened. They learned. And so did I. He nodded. Then it's only the beginning. For once, the weight on my shoulders didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The following Saturday, I woke to the scent of onions sizzling in butter. For a moment, I thought I had dreamt it. Mark used to cook on weekend mornings, humming under his breath, filling the house with warmth. But when I stepped into the kitchen, it was Daniel, standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up his tie, discarded on the counter. He glanced over his shoulder. "Morning, Mom. Sit down. Breakfast will be ready soon." The words startled me more than the sight. For years I had been the one moving silently through this room preparing meals, while Helena criticized the smell or the portions. To see my son, my grown son, take that role without prompting, made me pause in the doorway. I sat at the table watching as he cracked eggs into the pan and whisked them briskly. He moved awkwardly, as though learning steps to a dance he had long avoided, but there was determination in the set of his shoulders. When he placed the plate before me, scrambled eggs toast, a small bowl of sliced peaches, I noticed he had set the table with care napkin, folded silverware polished. He poured coffee into my cup before serving himself. "I owe you more than apologies," he said, settling opposite me. "So I thought I'd start with actions. I know they're late, but they're real. I lifted the fork, tasted the eggs. They were slightly overdone, but the effort seasoned them better than any spice. My throat tightened. Thank you, Daniel. After breakfast, he surprised me again. I've been thinking about the garden, he said. It's overgrown in places. I'd like to help bring it back if you'll let me. The garden. For years, Helena had dismissed it as outdated something to be ripped up for a patio. Hearing my son speak of restoring it, not replacing it, pierced deeper than I expected. We spent the afternoon outdoors. The camellias were thick with blooms, their petals falling in soft drifts, while the magnolia leaves lay heavy on the ground. Daniel fetched the pruning shears and kneeled beside me, clipping away dead branches, hauling out weeds. Sweat ran down his temples, but he didn't complain. He asked questions instead about which roses Mark had planted, which herbs thrived in shade, which trees I refused to cut, no matter how unruly. For hours we worked side by side. The silence between us was not the strained quiet of years past. It was companionable, punctuated by small stories and shared laughter when he nearly toppled into the rosemary bush. When evening fell, we returned to the kitchen dirt still under our nails. Daniel set the table again this time with leftover casserole I had prepared earlier in the week. He placed me at the head of the table and took a seat beside, not across. As we ate, he looked at me with a steadiness I hadn't seen in years. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, he said, but I want you to know I see you now. Not as a burden, not as someone to keep quiet for convenience, as my mother who deserves respect. The words landed heavy, not because they were perfect, but because they were finally true. For years he had been present, but absent, letting Helena's disdain shape the air we breathed. Tonight he was trying to clear it. I studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the earnestness in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine a future where my son sat at my table without shame between us. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside the garden we had tended together rested under the night sky. Inside, I took another bite of casserole and allowed the fragile thread of reconciliation to weave its way across the table. The morning light slipped gently through the sheer curtains, painting the parlor in pale gold. I moved slowly the way one does when each step carries both memory and meaning. On the sill, my roses caught the sun, deep crimson, soft pink, pure white, each bloom cradled in a glass jar I had collected over the years. Their scent filled the room, delicate yet persistent, the same way dignity lingers long after shame has tried to erase it. I reached for the pruning shears and trimmed a fresh rose, careful to avoid the thorns. Its petals were velvet under my fingers, its stems sturdy alive. For years, Helena had called these flowers old-fashioned, just another reminder of a house she wanted to modernize into something sleek and soulless. Now, without her voice filling the air, the roses stood proud, and I stood with them. On the mantel above the fireplace sat the velvet box that held the pink diamond necklace. It was no longer hidden behind a painting or tucked away in a safe. It rested in plain sight, protected not by secrecy, but by truth. The documents were all in order. The will updated, the accounts secured. No one would mistake it for worthless again, least of all me. I carried the rose across the room and placed it beside Mark's photograph. His smile looked back at me from beneath the glass, steady and warm, just as it had the day we posed together in the garden. I touched the edge of the frame. "We made it through," I whispered. "Your foresight, my patience. Our home still stands." The kettle whistled in the kitchen and I poured myself a cup of tea. The china cup rattled slightly in its saucer, but my hand was steady. I sat by the window, letting the sunlight wash over me, watching the street outside stir to life. Neighbors walked their dogs, children pedaled bicycles, the city humming its usual tune, yet everything felt changed. Daniel came into the room, his hair still damp from the shower, carrying 2 plates of toast. He set one before me without a word, just a small nod. It was a gesture simple enough, but one that spoke volumes. He had begun to repay the rent he owed, not in money, not in apology, alone, but in respect. We ate together quietly, the scrape of knives against bread, the only sound. When he looked up at me, there was no pleading in his eyes, no expectation of pity, only recognition, and that was enough. After he cleared the dishes, I remained by the window. My gaze rested not on the garden's imperfections or the scars left by Helena's years of intrusion, but on the sunlight playing through the branches, the possibility of new blossoms yet to come. For the first time in a decade, I felt at peace within these walls, no longer invisible, no longer doubted. The scars were still there, yes, but they were mine, and they carried lessons sharper than any thorn. I leaned back the rose by Mark's photo, glowing softly in the morning light. Respect, I murmured, not pity, is the rent for a place in my life. And in the stillness of that moment, with the house secured, the necklace safe, and my heart no longer bowed, I knew I had claimed the life that was always mine to keep.